"We are coming home." 3 words that sound like redemption. But what if they're actually a warning siren? What if the real story isn't about coming back to the UK, but about whether they'll ever be allowed to keep their place in it? Today we're unearthing one of the most explosive royal showdowns in modern history. Not the glossy version told in statements, but the version whispered through constitutional drafts, legal corridors, and fractured family bonds. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Have you ever watched someone walk toward a door that might slam before they touch the handle? That's the tension. That's the story. And that's exactly where we begin. Beginning, hook plus stake setup. This isn't just family tension. It's institutional tension. And in Britain, institutions don't do emotional outbursts. They do quiet strategy followed by irreversible action. In 2020, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle exited the United Kingdom like a scene from a blockbuster. Crowd explosions, paparazzi flashbulbs, tell-all interviews being negotiated before the plane had reached cruising altitude. It felt like disruption. It felt like rebellion. It felt chaotic, historic, dramatic. But chaos attracts attention, and attention invites interpretation. The palace didn't control the narrative on the way out, so it began controlling it on the way back. But the public didn't see that shift. Not at the time. The world was distracted by streaming deals and celebrity alliances. The emotional gravity of that exit eclipsed the constitutional gears turning behind the monarchy. And when something is eclipsed, it's easy to think it stopped moving. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Battles don't pause when headlines do. They evolve behind them. So the question becomes, are Harry and Meghan actually the ones choosing to return? Or are they walking into the final moves of a chess match they no longer realized they were playing? Because while the public watched interviews and Instagram posts, the palace, the government, and constitutional lawyers were refining the single most powerful weapon of royal consequence: legitimacy. Because that's what titles represent, not sentiment. Legitimacy. A royal title isn't like a Hollywood award or a celebrity brand badge. A title carries constitutional oxygen. It tells the world who represents the crown, who holds proximity to state delegation, who can plausibly be confused as speaking for the monarchy instead of beside it. And confusion, in British constitutional language, is risk. And risk, to an institution built over 1,000 years, is threat. But here's the irony. Prince Harry, more than anyone, should have understood institutional threat. He was born inside it, bred inside it, educated inside it. The spare heir to a machine that historically protects itself by trimming anything that weakens its clarity. And yet, he executed his disruption strategy like someone who assumed emotional capital could override constitutional capital. And that was the first miscalculation. Because emotional capital expires quickly, constitutional capital doesn't. So now, in 2026, they're returning toward an institution that has had 6 years to quietly prepare its file. Ask yourself this. If you were part of a 1,000-year institution and 2 of your biggest representatives left noisily and returned noisily, threatening to redefine what loyalty and membership meant, what would you prioritize? Would you rely on emotion or paperwork fortified by precedent? This story matters right now because the monarchy is no longer fighting for headlines. It's fighting for definition. The UK government has shown increasing awareness of public trust fractures. Royal watchers have seen the word review become more common in political commentary. And review, in British institutional language, often precedes reassessment, which then precedes reallocation, which then precedes revocation. The public sees titles as identity labels. Institutions see them as delegated authority markers. And government sees them as potentially destabilizing branding confusion if left uncorrected. And this time, the tension isn't about whether a decision was too fast. It's about whether it was too late to reverse. Because as they debate warm nostalgia for Britain's prodigal Duke and Duchess, another part of Britain is debating whether those titles can remain without creating constitutional ambiguity. Ambiguity the monarchy can't afford. If chaos defined the exit, clarity would define the retaliation. Middle, build-up plus emotional undercurrent. Let's zoom in on the emotional current long enough to understand why this story gained the power it has. When Harry and Meghan left, the public interpreted it as a fairy tale fracture. a couple fleeing rigid tradition and hostile press. The emotional storyline was irresistible. The rebel prince, the self-made American actress, the media versus the palace. But while that emotional version gained momentum, the constitutional version simmered quietly. Does a royal title belong to you if you no longer represent the institution that grants it? And can you maintain the optics of proximity without maintaining the duties that justify it? These questions weren't hypothetical. They were structural. The monarchy learned long ago that its survival depends on definition stability. Monarchies that blur representation lines, that confuse celebrity narrative sovereignty with constitutional narrative sovereignty, eventually invite political audit. An audit invites amendments, and amendments invite negotiation, and negotiation invites consequence. The palace wasn't built to argue weekly. It was built to execute generationally. And here's the contradiction the public didn't see. Harry and Meghan's deals with global platforms required royal adjacency to retain commercial weight, yet explicitly disclaimed representation of the very institution that granted those titles. They said they didn't speak for the crown. But their entire brand worked because the world assumed they still stood near it. Do you see the tension? Because the lawyers definitely did. They weren't just public figures. They were constitutional variables. You can monetize royal proximity. But can you disclaim royal representation while still monetizing its symbols, assumptions, and authority inheritance in public imagination? That question is a constitutional paradox. And paradoxes, inside institutions like Buckingham Palace, don't lead to compromise. They lead to pruning. Meanwhile, UK MPs have watched the monarchy's public trust metrics become a political debate catalyst. If the monarchy is losing trust, it must be audited less through scandals and more through structure, which means identity symbolism becomes less important than constitutional clarity. In a parliamentary monarchy, the government doesn't get to control the crown, but it does get to question delegation confusion and public trust impact. Imagine if every institution you belong to allowed you to retain its authority markers while publicly disclaiming its representation. Would that institution become stronger or become incoherent? This is the exact question playing out in public imagination versus constitutional corridors. The public love the fairy tale, but institutions don't evaluate love. They evaluate precedent. And precedent is where this homecoming becomes catastrophic. Because in British constitutional history, every major representation ambiguity clash involving a royal has forced the institution toward very binary outcomes: abdication, removal from styling, revocation of delegated representation optics, or quiet legal isolation mechanisms that limit future branding confusion fallout. And while 2020 was a chaotic emotional spectacle, the past 6 years have been quieter, bureaucratic, methodical. And frankly, much more dangerous. Because chaos makes noise, but bureaucracy makes consequence. Do you know what else was bureaucracy? The revocation drafts surrounding Edward VIII. The isolation mechanics facing past spares. The silent legal angles deployed when nuance threatened crown definition. This return, unlike the exit, wasn't emotional. It was slow, tested, and drafted to survive challenge. You see, in royal crises, the palace doesn't get louder. It gets quieter until it doesn't need to negotiate anymore. The silence creates its own story. They were warned, and warnings were missed. And missed warnings become permission for consequence. Here's an emotional beat to sit in for a moment. Harry's relationship with Britain's security, heritage, and monarchy duties has always been emotionally complex. Beloved public prince, military champion, Diana's son, the approachable royal. But Meghan entered the monarchy as a story of modern reinvention. Hollywood meets Britain. Disruption equals modernization. Accessibility equals likability. But public likability isn't constitutional likability. And constitutional reinforcement cannot rely on social assumptions alone, especially when future clarity is threatened. So the palace fortified its file quietly, reviewed every precedent, consulted ministers with strategic ambiguity, tested public reaction via seeded headlines, drafted revocation paperwork months before flight bookings, and prepared to deploy clarity as institutional self-protection. But the world was busy laughing at a hospital TikTok dance. And that's the tension this video investigates. Love stories have expiration dates. But constitutional retaliations don't rely on them. End. Pull forward plus cliffhanger. So now we're left with the tension. Harry and Meghan preparing to land inside Britain again. The palace preparing to redefine whether their individual mythology ever gets to override constitutional clarity again. And the UK government watching, eyes open wider than public statements suggested. And that's where we transition into the next phase of the story, the machine behind the prodigal mythology. Because this time, the question isn't whether they're coming back. It's what they're coming back to. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how history treats returning royals like romantic plot lines? Britain has mastered the prodigal narrative. But what if the twist is that this time, the return isn't a victory lap? It's a deposition. What if instead of riding back into admiration, they're hurtling straight into a constitutional interrogation conducted by news tickers, legal footnotes, and carefully arranged optics traps? Because right here, as we reopen one of royal history's oldest tropes, the spare racing home, the stakes are bigger, quieter, and far less sentimental than you've ever been told. We are coming home sounds like a fairy tale flourish. We are coming home under review sounds like a government brief. Now ask yourself, which one are we really dealing with? When we think of royal homecomings, we think pageantry or repentance ceremonies. Kings and princes returning after banishment, exile, or scandal meant ceremonial theater, public forgiveness arcs, symbolic gestures, carriage rides, balcony moments, tea leaf leaks about unity. The spectacle was the point. The crowd was the court. The verdict was applause. Even when relationships were shattered, the choreography papered over the cracks long enough for myth to feel real. British royal history has shown us characters who left as villains, returned as sympathetic antiheroes, and were reabsorbed by public longing before institutions could clip their wings too tightly. But precedent is not nostalgia, and courtesy is not entitlement. So here comes the modern contradiction. Harry and Meghan didn't disappear into historical exile. They re-emerged in global markets. The moment they left, they stepped not off the stage, but onto a different one with brighter lighting rigs, Netflix, Oprah sofas, Invictus cheering arenas, Spotify microphones positioned like royal scepters dipped in venture capital. In the old narratives, you lost your kingdom when you lost your country. In the new ones, you might lose your country when you keep your kingdom branding. Harry and Meghan understood media cycles, talent cycles, fan cycles, but the institution they left behind understood constitutional survival cycles. One side worked in social spikes. The other worked in historical straight lines. When Edward VIII abdicated in 1936, the country shook for weeks. But the institution stabilized in decades afterward through clarity. He left a king. He returned a ghost. The Duke of Windsor was a defined variable post-abdication, no longer plausibly delegated as a mouthpiece of the crown. The paperwork outlasted the fever. The myth died in the margins. That example sits like a fossil under every modern revocation argument the palace could possibly draft today. But Harry is not a ghost. That's what makes this scarier. He's radioactive celebrity royalty crossing over into cultural myth-making without the restraints of constitutional silence. Celebrity royalty without constitutional loyalty markers increasingly resembles institutional risk. Britain's monarchy learned not to revoke proximity. It learned to revoke ambiguity. And ambiguity is exactly what this couple has accidentally weaponized for 6 years. Now let's replay the first moments of this return case file. Because that's what this feels like when you zoom in carefully enough on timing, a file building around a landing slot. It began at Heathrow in reverse, long before any suitcase had wheels rolling. The British establishment has always favored signals over statements. News whispers, off-record parliamentary curiosities, royal rota hints that feel gossipy but are actually constitutional sonar pings. When the first story circulated that a mechanism exists for title review, pluralized, softened, phrased like academic interest pieces, public watchers dismissed it as theoretical pondering. Constitutional scholars, however, heard only one real thing. The concept was now mainstream enough to socialize before execution. Insiders were dangling fragments. A title review hinted to journalists. Tensions between royal symbolism and citizenship optics. Parliament occasionally testing its teeth about constitutional role clarity. Government spokespeople carefully declining comment without declining jurisdiction. And every time a government declines comment in Britain, they're not silent. They're buffering. But the emotional interpretation machine swallowed everything first. Let's talk about that machine. The one the Sussex brand relied on without realizing it was rewriting the revocation argument against them. The world's media doesn't see monarchy the way Britain sees monarchy. To global platforms, the crown is fetish. To Britain, the crown is definition. To Americans, it was emotional rescue journalism. To Brits, it was institutional panic followed by bureaucratic patience. To Hollywood finance houses, royalty sells because it's recognizable. To Buckingham Palace lawyers, royalty gets questioned precisely when it's too recognizable without institutional boundaries attached to it. So we get contradiction number 1. A monarchy that doesn't want its symbolism diminished, dealing with a couple who scaled their dimensions through symbolism without constitutional oversight. Contradiction number 2. A couple that publicly disclaimed royal representation, yet built a commercial universe solidified by implicit representation adjacency. Contradiction number 3. A homecoming framed as reconciliatory pilgrimage, emerging simultaneously alongside increasing British institutional appetite for audit. And contradiction number 4, the biggest one in this trope flip. Harry leaving in 2020 overwhelmed the palace. Harry returning in 2026 might serve the palace. Because the narrative fuel isn't crowds anymore. It's clips, algorithms, and jurisdiction clarity wargaming in real time. Right now, you are watching British narrative shaping dynamics in slow motion. Stories seeded like tabloids, but structured like legal mood boards. They practically feel like chaotic gossip. But when you scrutinize them, they land on consistent pillars. Duty, delegation clarity, citizenship, state representation confusion risk, monarchy definition loyalty loophole skepticism, and whether adjacency optics can legally be pruned from a former working royal without destabilizing future spares. You can practically see the columns aligning into a revocation argument outline. Now let's tell the landing story itself in slow beats. One rumor sparked it. Before the phrase strip titles appeared in print like a threat, it appeared like a curiosity. A palace aide allegedly musing off-record that royal status is deserved by duty, not permanent geography. That phrasing isn't emotional. It's scaffolding. It tests the audience against concepts. Britain's royal communications always test implications long before enforcement. Then Parliament began socializing the notion more actively as Harry and Meghan were entrenching themselves in American life. Public watchers assumed this meant institutions would do nothing. But what it actually meant was institutions were preparing the emotional logic shield in advance. We don't hate them. We're defining crown-neutral survival. That's how you soften the blade before deploying it. Then came the travel speculation phase. Palace security disagreements leaked not as disagreements, but as logistical curiosities. Who might pay for protection? Who should pay for protection? Who has grounds to receive automatic protection? What's the difference between state-delegated protection and personality-delegated protection? Every question phrased like logistics is actually politics. Every political question is law. And every law question eventually snaps back to representation clarity. And representation clarity eventually snaps back to styles, styling, delegation, letters patent, peerage optics, HRH branding, residency optics, and government coordination. And government coordination eventually filters down to landing slots. So now we're in 2026. Britain is under a new constitutional review appetite. Royal identity symbols increasingly bumping into nationality symbols. Public monarchy trust metrics wiggling on news screens and political commentary. Insiders whispering that titles can be redefined if delegation optics confuse jurisdiction clarity abroad. And Harry and Meghan apparently rushing home to resolve what they assume is emotional distress, but may actually be legal exposure optics that isolate a future constitutional risk. Do you see why emotional returns are no longer emotional returns? Audience check-in. Have you ever noticed how the rules change when years pass and markets expand faster than constitutional definitions protect themselves? And now the airports see that rule flip too. They boarded their flight, not just physically, but symbolically. The media immediately shaped two myth columns. The romantic prodigy column, coming home to family feud resolution, and the revocation anxiety column, racing home before titles fall. Public watchers assumed neither column was fact. Buckingham Palace lawyers needed only one column to feel loud enough to get the file mainstreamed conceptually before execution. Meanwhile, consider their emotional calculus. Harry has always felt psychologically squeezed between being the most relatable royal and being the spare to a system that historically protects itself through pruning. Meghan believed disruption popularity could modernize the institution from outside, and both sides assumed return timing was triggered by sentimental urgency. But you know what triggered it in modern monarchy battles? Commercial oxygen. That oxygen is popularity, repres. By sentimental urgency. But you know what triggered it in modern monarchy battles? Commercial oxygen. That oxygen is popularity, representation, confusion, currency, adjacency, symbolism, selling power, and national monarchy trust, precaution, bureaucratic culture blend. This oxygen, once confused enough, triggers audit conversations. And audit conversations trigger lawyers. And lawyers trigger drafts. And drafts trigger flights. So let's talk about what happens to myths when drafts get prepared. They're returning not to an unresolved feud. They're returning to a feud whose most decisive arguments were drafted behind closed doors once enough emotional narrative had been socialized publicly without constitutional tethering clarity. What does this mean to monarchy champions? It means the definitional war might no longer be fought on their terms. The institution is no longer reactive. It's preemptive. It's testing the durability of courtesy illusions while quietly evaluating loyalty, clarity, jurisdiction, confusion, risk. This is the exact phase during which institutions perform confident execution, not gossipy explanation, because they have no incentive to broadcast drafts before landing spots are procedural and irrevocable. And yet the crowd loves the procedural theater assumption narrative more than the constitutional definition narrative. The crowd doesn't matter because crowds no longer verdict monarchy myths. Clicks do. So we have entered the age of homecomings by hashtag. Let's break open the emotional beats here. When Harry left Britain, he left 1,000 years of institutional inertia behind him. Inertia so big, it took months to respond. And even then, most watchers assumed the response was philosophy, not mechanism. But months in institutions like the Crown are not timeouts. They're sprints. Meanwhile, Meghan assumed emotional popularity adjacency could modernize identity while retaining constitutional symbolism without the Crown's explicit delegation. That's contradiction number 5. Believing modernization can happen without institutional bottling, oversight, choreography. Overshoot result. Every spare heir increasingly becomes a defined precedent pivot risk analysis subject, not a sentimental protagonist myth label holder. Now, before we reach the cliffhanger, let's close the loop carefully. Britain has always used the quiet moment, the travel window when global royal ambiguity is loud enough, to set up identity exposure traps for stakeholders that assume adjacency optics equal permanent delegation. The institution deploys its file after social consensus is shaped enough around conceptual review, not around specific hatred. No hatred means no public attack vulnerability. No vulnerability means no public negotiation imperative. No negotiation imperative means no compromise spectacle. No spectacle means execution timing. Execution timing means drafts on flight timetables. Flight timetables mean jurisdiction snapshots. Jurisdiction snapshots eventually determine title vulnerability styling phase. And that pen is heavier in 2026. Which leads us to modern monarchy myth flip number 1. When you return, the institution might own your symbolism and your timeline. Homecomings don't change institutions. Institutions change homecoming definitions. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The monarchy has a secret language. It isn't smoke and mirrors. It's memos and momentum. And between 2020 and 2026, something fascinating happened. Every time Prince Harry and Meghan Markle spoke about freedom, the palace spoke less and prepared more. Let me ask you a question right away, before we go any deeper. Have you ever wondered why powerful institutions let someone finish their sentence before they start their own? Because interruption gives you narrative dominance. Patience gives them narrative ownership. Now, here's where the Real story begins to reveal its edges. Harry and Meghan didn't just leave the UK. They left a job description, but not the business card. They dropped duties, but kept distinction. And distinction without duty isn't honor inside the monarchy. It's noise inside the system. The British monarchy classifies royal titles in a way the public often misunderstands. These are not sentimental trophies. These are constitutional identifiers. They act as symbolic delegation markers within statecraft optics. But once you detach from institutional obligation, the very markers that gave you power begin to look like misattributed delegation optics risk. And when risk escalates, Britain doesn't escalate voices. It escalates process. So how do you strip titles? You don't. You redefine the justification. And justification isn't popularity. Justification is a closed-loop inheritance of service optics that sustains constitutional alignment. Now imagine you're a future historian, 6 years from now, trying to interpret the story of two senior royals who publicly claimed they didn't want to speak for the crown while using crown branding adjacency optics to secure media ventures that implicitly rely on speaking near the crown. What would you call that? Reinvention? Or ambiguity? Here's the answer Buckingham Palace lawyers were quietly circling: not reinvention. Ambiguity. Because ambiguity is contagious. And contagions are pruned. Before the strip titles slogan hits print, the machinery started humming long ago. The revocation question is neither whimsical nor vindictive. It's constitutional housekeeping. Lawyers, ministers, polling strategists, Rota insiders, all aligning into one singular conversation column. Can delegated identity markers remain outside delegated obligation without generating public misunderstanding about constitutional representation in the global sphere? Months of silence followed exit chaos. That silence felt like defeat to critics. It actually served as incubation to the institution. Because a monarchy that responds immediately reveals its nerves. A monarchy that pauses is fortifying its scaffolds. Inside Britain's system, the monarchy never revokes identity without revoking ambiguity first. And revoking ambiguity requires something more powerful than public opinion. Social consensus about justification fragility, not personal fragility. So here's the fascinating twist. The palace didn't begin by building arguments against Harry the person or Meghan the person. It began by building arguments for the institution's clarity. It started with a constitutional reality. HRH, Duke, Duchess, Prince, Princess, symbols that carry monarchy representation adjacency optics. But adjacency optics without duty is like owning the brand of a company you publicly quit. Let me ask you again. Have you ever quit a job but kept telling the world you were basically still part of the team? Feels harmless until the shareholders start worrying what you imply. Now at the government layer. Britain runs a parliamentary monarchy, meaning ministers don't meddle in the crown's line of succession itself, but they absolutely monitor public trust implications tied to ambiguous state representation currency. And this period saw more UK political interest peaks around monarchy optics than in decades prior. Notice the quiet shift in how this is phrased by officials. Not strip their titles because we dislike them, but review the delegation meaning of styling outside institutional obligations to protect constitutional clarity abroad. Which means this is not personal. This is precedent. Because personal complaints can be ignored, precedents must be sorted. Meanwhile, the public enjoyed the emotional drama narrative, the couple fleeing press cruelty, reinventing themselves as international humanitarians, modernizing the monarchy from afar. But that speculated public ideal narrative is the exact assumption lawyers wanted to test against title justification logic. Behind closed doors, the gears were turning. To find the problem, delegated identity markers retained outside delegated obligation create crown delegation confusion risk abroad. Socialized justification fragility. Public headlines hint to title deserved by duty, not residency. Leaked like gossip, structured like legal mood testing. Consult ministers without statements. Refusal to comment without refusal to coordinate landing optics means concept is jurisdictionally mainstreamed enough to soften personal negotiation imperative. Draft paperwork quietly. Tested constitutional removal examples always prioritize crown definition clarity before individual identity narrative fluidity. Buffer the emotional logic shield. Not hatred, but clarity. Not chaos, but process. Do you see what the palace did? They sidestepped personal outrage optics. They allowed emotional drama to garnish the exit while fortifying institutional clarity imperatives for the return. Now consider the psychology of their side. Harry has always seen monarchy loyalty through the lens of people, his grandmother, his father, his brother, his mother's legacy influence. Meghan saw transformation through the lens of perception, likability, modern optics, disruption with purpose. But institutions like Buckingham Palace don't speak in grand perception arcs. They speak in legal oxygen, delegation clarity, styling fragility audits, and precedent alignment memos. Here's the central paradox the lawyers drafted around. Can identity symbolism be retained when representation symbolism is disclaimed? If yes, does that make the crown clearer or blurrier? And if it blurs it, does the crown get stronger or invite political audit? That is not a question of family romance. That is a question of constitutional risk. And constitutional risk, if phrased compellingly enough in social rotations, eventually demands binary resolution. Now fast forward to the boarding moment. They packed their bags at the exact time the palace was packing arguments about justification fragility. The world assumed the word strip meant retaliation. The palace assumed the word review. Review eventually leads to reassessment. Reassessment leads to recommendation. Recommendation leads to letters patent vulnerability execution windows. And execution windows lead to flights timed not by love, but by jurisdiction snapshotting moments. Ask yourself, when does recommendation stop being theoretical curiosity and become constitutional momentum? Answer, when it exits gossip margin language and enters ministerial look-back ping language without negotiation incentive disruptions. And that's the tension you didn't see. They planned to land inside Britain again. The palace planned to define what landing meant before they touched the runway. And the government, watching neutrality optics fracturing under glare, began protecting itself through silence that actually signaled coordination appetite without opposition spectacle. Which brings us to inequality flip that's been drafted for years. The monarchy loses nothing by letting emotional heroes finish talking. It only loses something if precedent heroes finish walking home without constitutional clarity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They left the UK to escape a storm. They're returning to discover the storm learned British patience. It waited, hardened, and quietly renamed itself due process. Let me ask you something before we go further. Have you ever noticed how rumors feel chaotic until the moment they rhyme? That rhyme? That's a pattern. And patterns, inside royal institutions, turn into procedure, not apologies. The palace leaks nothing by accident. Leaks are annotations. Silence is architecture. And architecture always holds more weight than outrage. Buckingham Palace's calm strategy in the modern era resembles one thing above all: deliberate ambiguity shielding. The public hears stories like fireworks, short bursts of color and sound that fizzle quickly. The palace hears accents, precedents, jurisdiction edges, citizenship optics, identity disclaimers, styling vulnerabilities, ministerial coordination appetite, public trust fluctuations, and global adjacency risk metrics. All the ingredients that eventually get distilled into the institution's favorite brew. Define consequence without televised drama negotiation imperative exposures. This chapter unravels that contradiction's birth. They thought silence meant stalemate. Silence meant compilation. When a file grows thicker, the crown gets quieter. When it gets quiet, a draft is maturing. And when drafts mature, landing becomes exposure. Because exposure is the currency institutions use when confrontation is no longer needed. Let's unpack how we got from "we're progressive royals abroad" gestures to "are those titles constitutional noise risks at home?" Corridors. How palace protocol fights now. When the Sussexes exited, the public conversation was emotional and fast. Harry spoke in contradiction arcs. Meghan spoke in manifest destiny reframe arcs. The press spoke in soap opera arcs. Parliament, silent with curiosity appetite. The monarchy, silent with self-protection appetite. Silence versus silence looked like nothingness. But they were two very different silences. One silence said, "Let's not give oxygen to open negotiation battles." The other silence said, "We're drafting the sieve." Harry's monarchy role post 2020 wasn't defined by exile. it was defined by adjacency monetization. And that was constitutional contradiction fuel. Because Britain has a 1,000-year playbook, if adjacency can be monetized outside duty, duty/adjacency definitions must be refined to prevent global representation contagion abstraction rifts. Now enter the first anomaly moment the world dismissed. Instead of revoking them in 2020, the palace absorbed press hits silently while fortifying a justification audit runway elsewhere, inside the UK government layer. You see, this wasn't about kicking them out. This was about redesigning what still in is allowed to look like. Government players do not move monarchy pieces, but they move jurisdiction pieces. Britain's government officials never claimed jurisdiction over title removal. They only declined to confirm exclusion from process loops. Declining to confirm process exclusion is like declining to insist neutrality. That non-insistence itself is coordination permission appetite signaling. In constitutional monarchies, representation clarity is a diplomatic currency. It affects trade optics, Commonwealth sentiment columns, state neutrality illusions, public trust impacts, and how policy legitimacy is interpreted abroad. This period saw the government and the Crown exchange two essential memos without press conferences. Public trust metrics around monarchy optics are now political conversation catalysts. Delegation symbolism abroad must not appear negotiable without binary justification loops. Ask yourself this. Have you ever tried to explain to the internet that you don't represent the monarchy, only to build a brand that works precisely because the internet assumes you still basically might represent the monarchy? That is the paradox. And Britain's system cannot let paradox become precedent without resolution. From celebrity reinvention to constitutional vulnerability, Meghan Markle's reinvention abroad relied on humanitarian gravitas, but entertainment adjacency handshake optics deals that require royal symbolism recall brand weight, which exists because the public assumes she's still basically near the core. Harry's reinvention relied on the Diana legacy relatability beat, but uncalibrated delegated monarchy service markers retained without institutional duty packaging, which leads to global representation confusion precedent fuel, which leads to modern monarchy contradiction they didn't see. Reinvention without duty still needs symbolism, but symbolism needs paperwork oxygen. But paperwork oxygen for titles must be justified by alignment loops at home, not perception loops abroad. Perception loops expire fast. Constitutional loops don't. So the palace let them fly high as public characters while quietly placing the battleground where Britain actually writes verdicts. Definition, not drama. Public narrative, fairy tale. Palace file narrative, precedent. The public conversation about their exit and coming home messaging developed in bright, emotional hues. Fairy tale fracture. Nostalgia for the rebel prince. Villainization by tabloids. Heroization by Hollywood. Monetized adjacency. Constitutional confusion invisibility via press spectacle illusions. But the palace conversation about them developed in binary ink. Do titles fuel clarity or contagion? Is monarchy delegation deserved by duty or adjacency illusions? Can courtesy markers survive review, mainstreaming, without negotiation appetite incentive disruptions? Our identity deals loophole vulnerabilities or leash lines. Each teases answers the world doesn't see until payoff time, because payoff is the procedural curtain drop moment when recommendation becomes policy. Calibrating the return with evolutionary irony. Consider the royal analogy here. A monarchy is like a lighthouse. If ships assume a lighthouse moves when someone waves at it on Netflix, the reef near the shore becomes the problem, not the waves. And when the reef becomes mainstreamed point of discussion, the lighthouse doesn't apologize to the waves. It issues new coordinates, which means another flip they didn't see. When you return, you're being judged not on whether you left, but on what leaving implies for everyone who comes after you. The tactical silence pattern. The press kept asking why the palace was silent. The public kept asking if the couple was being punished. But what the palace was actually doing was quietly aligning the public to a new meta-consensus question. Are royal titles symbols you carry forever, or symbols you earn by duty loops that sustain representation clarity jurisdiction alignment at home? Asking that question publicly for 6 years softens the narrative weight of personal confrontation later because it reframes title removal not as palace anger, but palace self-definition necessity. The trip back optics became the storyline civ itself. They imagined the UK would greet them as heroes or as reconciliatory pilgrims, depending on your media preference. But the civ was already written by time. They boarded the flight to return. The civ was an ideology. It was architecture. You can walk home under mythology glare, but mythology glare tests justification, vulnerability, clarity, jurisdiction, confusion, risk metrics. And a file was quietly being collated long ago to test whether those optics survive entry without constitutional tethering again. Ask yourself this: when does rumor become system? When it rhymes enough. Between 2020 and 2026, these rumors rhymed. Titles tied to duty, not geography. Symbolism monetized without institutional delegation memos. Government silent coordination signaling. Lawyers briefed without spectacle negotiation appetite, incentive disruptions. The UK audit appetite quietly growing around monarchy trust hotspots. The Crown working toward definitional clarity without personal confrontation, oxygen exposure. And finally, flight timing matching vulnerability testing architecture. Which brings us to the key point. This was no longer about a royal couple returning as individuals. This was about a royal couple returning as constitutional variables inside a story civ maturing for 6 years. The emotional kicker foreshadowed, but not paid off yet. Harry thought he left too fast. Meghan thought she modernized from outside. The press thought the palace lost the plot. The government thought no comment was neutral. The palace thought no comment was protection before draft. The public thought, we'll keep our titles, was obvious. The lawyers thought, titles must not confuse representation abroad, was obvious. And both sides thought the other would blink first. But institutions don't blink. They file. Closing cliffhanger. So now they're about to land inside the UK again. A landing they think is about reunion. But when the paperwork finally speaks, it rarely speaks to reunion first. It speaks to definition. Because if 2020 was the shout, 2026 is the stamp. And just when you think they're walking back into emotional theater, what they're actually walking back into is a file whose silence was the trap, not the absence. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The myth of the returning royal always starts with romance. The mechanism behind it always starts with risk assessment. And the scary part isn't that those two stories collide, it's that one of them planned the collision. Let me ask you this, before we crack open the tension. Have you ever stepped back into a group chat thinking you were part of the conversation, only to realize everyone else had been drafting terms and conditions while you were typing emojis? That's phase 2 of the Sussex saga, not the exit, not even the flight, but the clearance. Because airports don't grant symbolism. Governments grant clearance. Clearance grants optics. Optics feed jurisdiction snapshots. Snapshots feed consequence scaffolds. The chaos of 2020 versus the calculus of 2026. When they left the UK, the backlash was emotionally molten and institutionally foggy. Statements flew faster than legal definitions could coagulate. The glare was too hot. The palace stepped back from the flame, but not from the fight. Between 2020 and 2026, the blueprint refined itself into a tragic irony. A couple selling monarchy adjacency to the world while the world debated monarchy legitimacy back home. The more global endorsement they earned, the more domestically misunderstood their role became. And misunderstanding, by the Crown's classification, that's noise. And noise eventually gets muted or managed. But the public had a different name for this misunderstanding. They called it media cruelty, narrative sabotage, institutional hostility. Useful labels, but not accurate architecture, because the Crown wasn't fueled by tabloid insults. It was fueled by constitutional precedent anxiety. Who's in charge of landing optics for former working royals? Here's something royal watchers rarely zoom in on, but constitutional policy experts practically hear in surround sound. Not every royal travels under the same delegation privileges. Some travel as state representatives, some as private citizens with courtesy styles, and a few rare ones travel while their symbolic identity is under jurisdictional dispute. Let me translate that into human terms. If a government refuses to confirm title removal but also refuses to deny process coordination appetite. What they are doing is leaving the door open for landing exposure optics without confrontation incentive negotiation vulnerability. Which means this: Meghan and Harry weren't just flying back to Britain. They were flying into Britain's oversight sphere, with their styling classification deliberately unpinned long enough to make the landing itself test justification vulnerability consistency. Ask yourself, who actually controlled airport clearance optics? Was it the couple, the palace, the UK government, or the lawyers who triangulated all three? The answer is far more predictable than the public narrative allowed it to be: the lawyers. Because the lawyers are the only stakeholders incentivized to write jurisdiction snapshot logic that outlasts media cycles and emotional storytelling. Security debates weren't debates, they were stress tests. This is another moment where the irony spikes. Bucking tradition, they expected automatic sovereign tier protection when landing back home. But what they received, via leaks and commentary, was a drawn-out public security funding curiosity festival that asked, who pays for security? Who gets automatic protection? What happens when you leave duty but keep distinction? What happens when you keep distinction but disclaim delegation? These questions weren't being resolved out loud. They were being socialized out loud. And when you socialize questions long enough, the answers stop belonging to individuals. They start belonging to systems. Which means while the public was emotionally siding, the Crown plus government layers were legally question garnishing without negotiation oxygen exposure obligation expansions. And every time Meghan or Harry said their protection was personal rather than state-delegated, they added weight to the very column that allowed lawyers to frame the next phase. Well then, your titles are personal currency too, not sovereign delegation necessity loops that sustain constitutional alignment abroad. Do you see the rhetorical trap? Because they didn't. They thought media was the battlefield. It was the misdirection. The real battlefield was classification. Classification precedes consequence. Inside UK constitutional frameworks, royal titles fall into tiers. These tiers determine styling vulnerability, government coordination optics involvement permission appetite, public monarchy trust association threshold buffering tolerance, delegation symbolism allowable currency proximity without confrontation negotiation oxygen exposure obligation expansions, courtesy illusion survivability review mainstreaming viability. If you think of this like brand management, you get the wrong stakes. If you think of this like constitutional signal integrity, you get the right stakes. One institution cannot afford to let a global platform assume two former working royals still obviously speak near the crown, while those two disclaimed speaking for the crown domestically, carrying representation paradox into foreign diplomatic sphere optics that affect public law precedents domestically. It's messy when you say it slowly. It's simple when you stamp it. And here comes the energy mistaken by publics. Stamping doesn't come after feud resolution. Stamping is the resolution. The landing optics traps were narrative sieves disguised as tabloids. Let's walk through the ingredients that made this slow burn turn procedural. They left Britain noisily. The palace let the noise burn itself out. They monetized royal adjacency globally. The palace monetized ambiguity domestically as justification tests. They disclaimed crown representation. The lawyers used that disclaimer as representation paradox vulnerability reframe. Security funding was questioned publicly. Question mainstreaming achieved without palace negotiation incentive confrontation vulnerability exposures. Government refused comment. Refusal did not include refusal to consider coordination loops or classification outcomes. Silence served jurisdictional mental file alignment draft memory consolidation cooperative signaling appetite indicators without negotiation oxygen exposure obligation expansions. Brand weight grew abroad without duty loops. Duty loops matter at home, not abroad, which leads us to the uncomfortable formula the palace was waiting to deploy. If your exit wrote the emotional narrative, your landing wrote the constitutional narrative. We only had to let one of them harden to hold narrative ownership later. Do you feel the chill? Because Britain's institutions definitely did. The paradox of returning under courtesy styles while disclaiming delegation optics sustains constitutional pruning appetite. They boarded an international flight believing the turbulence was about injury, emotional injury, political injury, media injury. The real turbulence was about inherited optics and public law representation, adjacency classification vulnerability frameworks. And once you classify a royal couple as constitutional variables, not senior duty holders, the question of strip their titles is no longer a press tantrum. It becomes constitutional hygiene, which means landing clearance itself becomes the final test. Which tier do they fall into once stepping onto British soil again? And is it a tier that creates constitutional risk or backing removal justification scaffolding? This is why the airports matter. Heathrow clearance becomes constitutional theater without carriages. The runway becomes Parliament's mood board without speeches. The passports become identity anchors while titles become identity footnotes under London jurisdiction optics contrast case sieve triggers. And the most fascinating irony of all, the Crown didn't need to declare war. It built the war into the landing manifest. Closing cliffhanger transition. Everyone expected a press conference. Everyone expected a confrontation. Everyone expected balcony theatrics or family truce optics. No one expected classification stamps issued by travel clearance timing logic. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. 3 words lit the fuse: we are coming home. But the real spark? Home had redrafted the meaning of them years ago. Let me hit you with a question before we build. Have you ever tried to plug a charging cable into a socket, only to realize the current changed voltage while you were midair? That's the story of monarchy, celebrity, and constitutional current collision. They left assuming the crown was immovable. They're returning to a crown that studied motion. The illusion of invulnerability versus the reality of letters patent fragility. Here's public myth number 1. A royal title is like a surname in history books. Permanent, welded, ceremonially weatherproof. But here's the institutional reality. Royal styling and peerage hierarchy are creatures of issuance, not immortality. They live or die by documents. The most powerful of those documents? Letters patent. Letters patent are monarchy instruments that can create titles, limit titles, redefine titles, or quietly remove styling privileges attached to titles without rewriting the entire peerage. What does this mean in human terms for H&M? They didn't need to lose the dukedom to lose the leverage of the dukedom. They just needed to lose the styling attached to it. And styling is powerful because styling, not the peerage itself, drives representation optics abroad. So the Palace Plus lawyers built a file around one core question. Could HRH and delegated styling remain when representation was disclaimed, duty dropped, and adjacency monetized, without causing constitutional confusion risk abroad? And once you ask that question long enough, 6 years is a lifetime in institutional patience. You don't need confrontation. You need filing. And a draft. The more global the platform, the more domestic the fragility. They assumed they left Britain behind. They didn't. Britain followed them into foreign optics paradox exercise. When global platforms frame stories about British royals, they don't read constitutional nuance. They read cultural symbolism. A crown, a duchess, a prince, a duke. But cultural symbolism untethered from constitutional obligation becomes a boomerang when your commercial success relies on royal recall. Your public statements disclaim royal delegation. And the UK is quietly debating monarchy legitimacy metrics. Contradiction number 1 we tease, now pay off later. Celebrity storytelling arcs celebrate reinvention. Palace storytelling arcs classify reinvention as delegation confusion risk if uncalibrated by documentation. Contradiction number 2. They said they didn't want to represent the crown, but every endorsement they've ever negotiated works because the world assumed they still plausibly might be near it. That's constitutional fog. Contradiction number 3. Their brand strength was built abroad. Their legal vulnerability was built at home. The palace only had to let one strengthen long enough for the other to be rewritten as a pruning case file. Ask yourself this directly, audience style. What happens when the thing that makes you powerful publicly is the same thing that makes you review-worthy privately? Palace mechanics don't hinge on popularity. They hinge on precedent durability. Between 2020 and 2026, the palace leaned into a meta-truth. Spares become precedent fodder whether you like them or not. They have generational implications. And generational implication is the Crown Plus lawyers' real KPI, not sympathy metrics. Because remember this historical footnote, they'll never put on a bumper sticker. Every time a senior royal brand detaches from constitutional tethering but retains delegation optics too loudly, the monarchy invites political audit. And a vote to audit the monarchy always begins with permission to audit the symbolism of spares first. This is the logic sieve beneath every seated headline from 2021 onward. Titles should reflect service, not speculation. Delegated styling cannot outlast constitutional obligation. Courtesy illusion is not constitutional illusion. History repeats. Paperwork evolves. It feels repetitive when you say it fast. But institutional rhyme is how procedural inevitability begins. The homecoming file was quietly built atop rhetorical scaffolds. The palace strategy leveraged not direct confrontation, but a carefully channeled sequence of concept mainstreaming. Social consensus about title justification fragility was seeded through press curiosities. Legal brief corridors were mapped without public oxygen exposure obligation expansions. Government neutrality language buffers remained intact not through commentary, but through refusal to deny coordination appetite entirely. Draft stamps were quietly matured around styling revocation without peerage dismantling. Celebrity glare was allowed to outpace constitutional glare until glare physics inversed upon return approach. Ask yourself, when does glare invert force direction? Answer: when the institution owns the return timing but the public owns the emotional reason for it, which is exactly the phase currently unfolding. The key irony that stings hardest. Harry and Meghan think they're coming home to fix a feud with family. The palace thinks they're coming home to complete the final phase of a feud with ambiguity. Because this time, they fly back as public emotional heroes. They land as constitutional case variables. The institution owns the encounter frame, and the lawyers own the timestamps. Meanwhile, the world has another contradiction ready to explode at payoff time. Harry is still the king's son, but the Duke's symbolism jurisdiction review stage was never about lineage. It was about delegated representation optics liability. Lineage survives love. Styling survives service. Service survives filing. Filing survives 6 years of silence. Love doesn't sue silence. Direct audience gut check. Have you ever noticed how the monarchy never says you're banned? It says your style is under review. Because banned creates heroes. Review dissolves protagonists into paperwork. And paperwork is where the crown wins every long game. Cliffhanger transition. So now they're returning toward British soil at the exact time the Palace Plus constitutional machine was returning toward definitional hygiene, with no negotiation, incentive confrontation, oxygen exposures, and that convergence wasn't sloppy. It was scheduled. And if you assumed this was a love story turning bad, you missed the genre tag. It was a homecoming story turning legal. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Let's start with the revelation you've been circling without quite seeing. Institutions don't fight the people who leave. They fight the versions of those people that get accidentally mythologized. And if you mythologize loudly enough, the enemy doesn't rush to correct you. It waits until the correction causes the least damage to them, and the most damage to the myth. Everyone thought the palace was wounded in 2020. The palace was actually taking notes for 2026. Let me ask you something before the story accelerates. Do you think monarchies fear rebels? Or do they fear the precedent that rebels leave lying around unsecured for the next generation to trip over? The UK is not just a geography. It's a jurisdictional pressure cooker with tea saucers. And you don't re-enter a pressure cooker quietly. The constitutional scenes shift, the public misread. Britain is a constitutional monarchy, which means 3 critical truths coexist at all times. The crown grants titles. The government manages state optics. Lawyers manage everything else. When the Rota began gossiping in 2021 that title reviews may occur if representation optics risk confusion abroad, the public shrugged it off. It sounded academic. Those words were not academic. They were preparatory linguistics for consequence scaffolding without emotional negotiation battles. MPs don't strip HRH or dukedoms. They discuss what those styling tiers imply if misinterpreted as state delegation markers abroad. And when they discuss implications, they consult constitutional scholars. And when scholars consult, they draft binary branches. And when binary branches are drafted, the crown doesn't hold a press conference. It holds a meeting schedule. So while Americans heard the 2020 exit as personal liberation, Parliament and Palace legal teams were quietly accepting jurisdiction, not over their hearts, but over their headlines. This was the anomaly of modern monarchy disruption. The exit felt like a story. But stories expire. Liability doesn't. Timeline mapping without televised oxygen. Between 2020 and 2026, the Palace timeline was less about events and more about fortifying narrative lanes, which meant the Palace ran two parallel loops. Loop 1, public stagecraft insulation. Let the tabloids inflate and villainize the couple. Let Americans heroize the couple. Let streaming houses monetize adjacency. Let the family relationship appear publicly personal, not procedural. Loop 2, constitutional hygiene archive building. Track every representation paradox. Annotate each jurisdiction vulnerability. Catalog PR adjacency amplification risk. Consult ministers on clearance optics boundaries. Draft potential styling leash lines quietly, without dismantling peerage. Ask yourself, have you ever realized the version of you that appears most famous publicly is the same version of you institutions are most eager to redefine privately? That's institutional irony in surround sound. The UK government layer and the security paradox. Now we enter the security pillar, tangent disguised as optics, optics disguised as concern, concern disguising a constitutional truth. Former working royals cannot retain sovereign tier protection optics that implicitly read as crown delegation markers abroad without constitutional tethering duty loops to justify them if representation is publicly disclaimed. Translation into human. You can't say you're a private citizen and also obviously expect the state to protect your brand like you still speak for the thing you quit. But the press framed security funding arguments like, should they pay their own way? Is the UK taxpayer footing a celebrity bill? Does the Palace still authorize protection? Should IPP status stay or go? All spicy copy. All constitutional marinade. Here's the twist. This conversation was never about whether they deserve security. It was about what that security tier implies for state representation clarity if the optics are exported abroad via celebrity glare. The Palace didn't fight the security. It audited the implications of the security conversation itself. Ask yourself again, if you can confuse state delegation from outside the jurisdiction, do you forfeit the styling tier that benefits most from that confusion? More practically, is the crown safer letting the world see you as a protected Duke and Duchess, or correcting the styling to reflect reality before correction becomes auditable precedent fuel for every spare who comes after? Clearing that contradiction required one thing. Silence long enough for the government to feel legally authorized to coordinate clearance optics without PR tantrum exposures. The visa, runway intersection. The lawyers loved one detail more than any interview transcript. Passports. Passports are sovereign truth serum. Prince Harry travels with diplomatic immunity adjacency symbolism. Meghan Markle travels as a US-UK dual influence branding adjacency figure leveraged by courtesy styling. And courtesy styling is the last tier you can legally challenge without destabilizing the deeper tiers like succession itself. So the Palace let them climb in global markets. And Britain fortified the sieve around passport jurisdiction classification versus title optics vulnerability. Because when you land, you're not landing into a headline. You're landing into a classification. And classification is where Britain writes its verdicts. Emotional beats the institution didn't have to dispute. Harry always wanted to be close to Diana's legacy archetype. Meghan always wanted to be close to Hollywood gravitas. Britain always wanted to be close to constitutional clarity. Those wants don't compete until flight and file timestamps collide. And collision was the plan. They thought homecoming meant Britain greets us again. But Britain greeted the problem again 6 years before the couple touched the runway. Because public jurisdiction gardening works only after review, mainstreaming dissolves personal confrontation incentive. Dissolving incentive dissolves negotiation. Dissolving negotiation dissolves myth sovereignty claims. Dissolving myth sovereignty claims dissolves delegated styling adjacency optics abroad that imply crown representation when representation is publicly disclaimed. Do you see the nested irony? They didn't realize that re-entry into Britain was backing into the one tier the lawyers could redefine without rewriting the monarchy itself. They were safe individually. They were vulnerable symbolically. Closing transition cliffhanger. So now, we're at the stage where clearance isn't paperwork. Clearance is spotlight. The palace doesn't get scarier when it speaks. It gets scarier when it doesn't have to. And it no longer had to speak before they landed. Because this time the long game was never about banishment from Britain. It was about banishment from ambiguity. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Let's open with a crack in the diamond that no one expected to fracture. For 6 years, the world fixated on the Sussexes as disruptors of monarchy optics. Meanwhile, the monarchy fixated on something far more tactical. The contagion of representation ambiguity metastasizing in a global media market that doesn't respect courtesy illusion borders, particularly when exported by former senior royals who publicly disclaim delegation duties but commercially benefit from adjacency symbolism that implies otherwise. And once ambiguity is contagious enough, the crown doesn't defend itself with emotion. It performs a precedentectomy. Let me throw a spark of curiosity at you right here. What do you fear more? A storm you can see, or a verdict you can't? Because Britain has mastered a third kind.